Hi everybody, welcome to your week 5 material for Community Psychology, Psych 1105. So this week we are looking at chapters 7 and 8 of your textbook on diversity and stress and coping. So let's start off with your Human Diversity Chapter 7 material, and then we will look at Chapter 8 on stress and coping. So, as a way of starting off this lesson, I often just try to get people to think a little bit about your own experiences of diversity. So this could be your own personal experiences, the kinds of things that you have experienced in relation to your friends and family, the community that you live in, etc. So if you just think for a moment about, the elements of your culture that you celebrate, how your gender, for example, influences your everyday life, how your socioeconomic status influences your everyday life, how things like your belief system or your religion affects your everyday life. So these are all dimensions of diversity that we are looking at in our class this week. And a lot of us, might go through our day-to-day life without giving these dimensions much thought, but this is really what we're talking about. So respect for human diversity and social justice and empowerment are important concepts for us in community psychology. These are part of our core values in our program. And so, of course, it's really important that we have a full understanding of what we mean by human diversity and the different dimensions of human diversity. So these are all of the different dimensions of diversity that we are going to be talking about this week for this week's lesson. So let's just strive forward. We'll move forward and talk about the different aspects. So the first aspect that you're seeing here, culture, this is kind of the first really big dimension of diversity that we discuss when we are thinking about just the expression of diversity, right? I think it kind of goes without saying that we live in a diverse, multicultural society here in Canada, right? Officially on paper, we are a multicultural country. That is part of our mission as a country. And so, of course, what culture is referring to are the different meanings and experiences that we share as a group. These meanings and experiences are often communicated across generations, from, grandmothers to grandchildren and parents to their kids, etc. Culture would include things like behavioral norms, shared documents, language, social roles, ways of thinking about things. Culture can include things like ethnicity. It doesn't necessarily have to, though. It can include things like your religion, your age, your family values, regional identity. So, we would be able to talk about culture as a concept that we would have here at Fanshawe College, that Fanshawe College has a culture, that students within a particular program have a culture, that London, Ontario has a culture, our county has a culture, there's a culture in Ontario, in Canada, for example. So there are lots of different ways to think about culture, and this is kind of the big one when we're talking about elements of diversity. So again, lots of different factors go into how we think about culture. We often think about practices, expected behaviors, values, the customs and rituals that we practice and celebrate on a day-to-day basis. So, these are the kinds of things that we're interested in. And of course, we know that some of these cultures are more socially accepted in the mainstream society than others, and some of these practices and rituals and celebrations might not be as accepted or appreciated or valued in mainstream society. So this is one of the things that I just kind of want you to have in the back of your mind as we're talking about human diversity is, how can an element of human diversity, unfortunately, kind of work against someone, for lack of a better word, right? How can people essentially take an element of human diversity and flip it around, right? So that it becomes a place where social inequalities can develop and where people can experience different forms of oppression. So just kind of have that in the back of your mind as we're going through this material. Now, when it comes to social injustice and oppression and social inequality, it probably goes without saying that our race or ethnicity is one of the big categories that we look at that has been used to justify prejudice for centuries and centuries, right? And it is still happening today, without a doubt, that there is a lot of racial or ethnic inequalities amongst people in our society. Even though on paper we are a multicultural society, and in Canada we say that we welcome all kinds of races and ethnicities, and that the color of your skin should not matter, when it comes to the kinds of opportunities that are available to you. Unfortunately, on the ground, so to say, we find that, people of color especially, so non-white people, do still experience various forms of racism. And, oh man, it's brutal, right? So this is a really big one that is still a major issue in our society and is getting a lot of high-profile media airtime in the States, especially as we hear about, a lot of the police brutality that is affecting the Black community down in the States, for example. So unfortunately, we know that racism is still a thing, and we need to be conscious of this. Now, race in and of itself, my students are often surprised to hear, is actually what we would consider to be a quasi-biological status. That, there really are no meaningful races of human beings, right? That, there really is no meaningful biological difference between people who we would consider to come from different races, genetically speaking, biologically speaking, etc. That the different biological sort of physical differences that we see between people, these are physical characteristics that have developed as a result of, thousands of years of evolution and all of that, right? So, race is not a thing. There you go. A little surprise for you there. The concept of ethnicity, of course, is very much a real thing, right? The country that you come from, right? Your country of origin. So that is what we would consider to be a more, valid form of identity rather than somebody's race. Racism, on the other hand, is very much a real thing, right? And that is the term that we use to describe oppression or discrimination that affects people based on their skin color or ethnicity. So these are, of course, some examples of racism that, we've talked a little bit in class already. We talked about eugenics a few weeks ago when we were looking at some of the history around community psychology, and that community psychology was reacting to some of these really creepy social practices that were happening in the early 1900s. Of course, we're all probably well aware of the civil rights movement that occurred in the United States throughout the 1900s, unfortunately still is taking place to a large extent today. But, when the United States was officially segregated on paper, right? When there were separate services for white citizens and black citizens, etc. So you've probably seen these famous posters of, help wanted, white only, or, photos of drinking fountains. One says whites only, one says blacks, etc. So, really, really, really unfortunate things that happened in the history of the United States. And yeah. So the next dimension of diversity that we look at is gender. So gender, of course, is referring to how we identify as male or female, or perhaps we identify as transgender. So the two terms that you're seeing down here at the bottom of the screen, I just want to draw your attention to those and explain what they mean. So cisgender refers to when a person is born with a certain genetic code, right, that programs or says that they are supposed to be a male or a female, and then they also identify as a male or a female, right? So for me, when I was born, my genetics instructed my body, for lack of a better word, right, to for me to be female. And I also very much feel like a woman inside of me, right? Like that's my gender identity is female. So my gender and my sex, right? So my sex is what is determined biologically from my genetics. My gender is how I feel as a person, right? How I identify. So my gender and my sex match. So I would be considered cisgender. For folks who do not feel that their gender and their sex match, right? So perhaps they were born with a male or female body, but they do not identify as a male or female. They identify as opposite or maybe somewhere in between, right? They would be considered, or they might call themselves transgender. So gender is not simply a demographic category. It's not simply a statistical category that we use to describe people, right? That we know historically that there has been a significant discrepancy between how resources and power were distributed in society according to males and females. In our society in Canada, we have not, women, I'm talking about now, women have not been able to vote yet for 100 years. So it was not yet 100 years ago when women got the right to vote. Things like owning property, right? Things like, being able to have job security if you had a baby, etc. These are all gender issues that have affected women disproportionately, that unfortunately were, held, as patriarchal issues, right, as patriarchal values. So, gender is a really important dimension of diversity for us to be conscious of in community psychology, for the way that it impacts people, of course. And what we now know is that members of our transgender community are, even though there is still work to do in the feminist community as well for equal rights for women, we still know that there's a pay gap. What we know is that the main focus of a lot of gender inequalities are affecting our transgender community disproportionately today, and so we've seen, again, a lot of media profiles of some of the issues happening in society around, transgendered, safe bathrooms and things like that, marriage rights, adoption rights, etc. So a few pretty major social issues that affect people on a day-to-day basis. All right, so that seems like a good place for us to end our part 1. In part 2, we are going to talk about social class or socioeconomic status, and that's where we will pick up. All right, thanks guys, you're doing great work. Hang in there.